What would you do if the world decided your existence was a crime? Not your actions, not your words, but your name, your face, your blood. Imagine waking up one morning and finding the ground beneath you no longer solid. That's what it was like in Europe in the early 1930s. A place of pride and poetry, of quiet villages and crowded cities, of symphonies and stone cathedrals, suddenly beginning to crack beneath the weight of a madness that had been hiding in plain sight. Anne Frank was born into that world. She wasn't born with fame. She wasn't born a fighter or a symbol. She was just a child like millions of others. Born on June 12, 1929, in Frankfurt, Germany. The second daughter of Otto and Edith Frank, Anne's world began in the quiet comfort of a liberal, educated, and loving Jewish family. Her father, Otto, was a businessman and former soldier of the German army during World War I, a man who believed in reason, in the power of culture, and in the promise of a more open, modern Germany. But promises, as Anne would learn, are fragile things. They shatter under boots. At the time of Anne's birth, Germany was in turmoil. The First World War had ended barely a decade earlier, and the country was still reeling from defeat. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed crushing penalties, financially and psychologically. Inflation raged, poverty spread, and with it came anger. And when people are angry, they look for someone to blame. Into that anger walked a man named Adolf Hitler. The world remembers Hitler now as a monster, but monsters rarely begin that way in the eyes of the people. He was a broken soldier turned orator, a failed artist turned prophet. He told the German people what they wanted to hear, that they were not broken but betrayed, not defeated but poisoned. And he pointed at the Jews. To Anne, those years might have seemed normal at first. She played with her sister Margot. She attended school. She watched the leaves change outside her window. But in the streets, posters began to appear. Newspapers shouted with venom. Old friends crossed to the other side of the road. The Nazis didn't seize power all at once. They were elected. They were applauded. They were welcomed by a country desperate for pride. And slowly, the world Anne knew began to dissolve. In 1933, when Anne was just 4 years old, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The laws began to change almost overnight. Jewish books were burned. Jewish teachers were dismissed. Jewish businesses were boycotted. Children were taught to sing songs of hatred in schoolyards where they once played tag. Otto Frank saw what was coming. He knew Germany was no longer safe for his daughters. And so, like many Jews who had the means and foresight, he made a decision that would shape the course of history, though he could not have known it at the time. He moved his family to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, hoping to escape the growing tide. They arrived in the city of canals, bicycles, and tulips with cautious optimism. Anne was just a child. To her, Amsterdam was a new adventure. She learned Dutch quickly. She made friends. She loved the city's rhythm, its openness, its bright shops and narrow houses. For a few years, life returned to something like peace. Otto Frank established a new business, Opekta, selling pectin for making jam. The girls attended school. They skated on frozen canals. They celebrated birthdays with laughter and cake. But across the border, the tide did not stop. Hitler consolidated power. The Nazis invaded Austria, then Czechoslovakia. The world watched, afraid but uncertain. And in 1939, when German tanks rolled into Poland, the Second World War began. The Netherlands tried to stay neutral, as it had during World War I. But in May 1940, German forces invaded. The Dutch army surrendered in days. And the Franks, like all Jews in the country, were plunged into darkness once again. It started as it had in Germany, quietly. Restrictions, curfews, identity cards. Jewish businesses were seized. Then Jewish children were forced out of public schools. Yellow stars appeared on coats. Every day another freedom vanished. Anne was now 10 years old enough to notice, old enough to ask questions. Why can't I go to that playground anymore? Why did the neighbors stop saying hello? Why do I have to wear this star? The walls were closing in, and yet through it all, Anne remained Anne. She was spirited, clever, mischievous. She loved movie stars and gossip. She wrote notes to her friends and daydreamed in class. She didn't know she was becoming a symbol. She only knew that the world felt smaller and stranger each day. Then came the letter, a single envelope that changed everything. In July 1942, Margot received a call-up notice to report for labor service in Germany. Everyone knew what that meant. Labor camps were not places you return from. The Franks had a decision to make, and they had to make it fast. Otto had been preparing for this. Months earlier, he had created a hiding place, a secret annex hidden behind a swinging bookcase in the rear of his business office. It wasn't much, a few rooms, no sunlight, no noise allowed during the day, but it was something, a lifeline. On July 6, 1942, the Franks disappeared from the world. Anne left behind her cat, her friends, her school books, and her world. She packed a small satchel and walked into the shadows of history. But just before she did, she was given a diary. It was a simple red and white checkered notebook, a birthday gift. She began writing in it almost immediately. And in that diary, Anne Frank would write herself into eternity. What does it mean to live a life in shadows? To breathe quietly so you aren't heard? To laugh silently so you aren't found? To grow up without sunlight and still believe in the dawn? When Anne Frank and her family stepped behind the movable bookcase into the annex of Otto Frank's office on July 6, 1942, they crossed into a parallel world, a place where time was suspended, where fear lingered in the air like dust, and where every creak in the floorboards could mean discovery. The secret annex became home not only to the Franks, but also to the Van Pels family and later Fritz Pfeffer, forming a constellation of 8 souls orbiting the same fragile center. Tucked behind the warehouse on Prinsengracht, the annex offered shelter, but never peace. It was both a sanctuary and a prison, a box that preserved life by confining it. Anne entered this space as a young girl, restless and vibrant, clinging to her diary like an anchor. The cramped rooms did not quiet her mind. They sharpened it. The silence outside magnified the noise within. As the days dragged on, Anne's words became her resistance, her therapy, her mirror. Early entries in her diary carry the tone of adolescence, squabbles with her mother, her frustrations with adults, the longing for normalcy. But even in these, one hears the crackling fire of her voice, a voice forming in exile, not in the expanse of freedom, but in the confinement of captivity. She described her companions not just with observation, but with piercing clarity, unafraid to name tension, resentment, or pettiness. There were quarrels over food, over silence, over everything and nothing. Emotions fermented in the stale air. Tempers rose in the absence of distraction. And yet Anne chronicled it all with the curious detachment of a writer and the sharp eye of a philosopher. Her room became her entire world. A narrow space shared with Fritz Pfeffer became the stage for reflection, frustration, and yearning. While others sought distraction, Anne found purpose. She studied, read voraciously, and poured herself into writing, not only in her diary but also in short stories and essays. Works never meant to be read, but infused with life. This was more than journaling. It was the forging of a voice. When a BBC radio broadcast in 1944 urged Dutch citizens to preserve wartime documents for future generations, Anne seized upon the idea with fervor. She began revising her diary. She gave herself an audience. Not just Kitty, her imaginary confidant, but the world. Anne rewrote entries, adding depth, clarity, and emotional resonance. She wanted her life to mean something. She wanted to be read, to be remembered. She didn't just want to survive the war. She wanted to transcend it. Even as food grew scarcer, tempers sharper, and the silence more deafening, Anne believed in the permanence of her words. I want to go on living even after my death. Those were not the words of a child hoping for fame. They were the words of a girl standing in defiance of oblivion. In a world built to forget her, she wrote to be remembered. And she was not just writing about the war. She was writing about identity, about gender, about isolation, about dreams. She was growing up behind a curtain of fear, and yet her introspection was radiant. In one reflection, she confided, When I write, I can shake off all my cares. My sorrow disappears. My spirits are revived. Anne's writing grew more refined. She wrestled with what it meant to be a girl in a world that made women small. She challenged the authority of adults. She demanded space for her thoughts, her sexuality, her solitude. She began crafting not just a record, but a legacy. The annex may have been still, but Anne's mind moved like a river. While the city beyond was shattered by bombs and occupation, she was building a world out of ink. Outside, Jews were being rounded up, deported, and erased. Inside, Anne was etching her existence line by line, defying erasure. Her faith in humanity faltered but never broke. Her optimism dimmed but did not go out. She wrote, "It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart." These weren't the platitudes of innocence. They were the deliberate choices of someone who understood darkness and still reached for the light. And in that reaching, she created something that no storm could erase. What is time when the days never change? When the world beyond your walls forgets you, and the world inside grows smaller with every breath? The secret annex had become both womb and tomb, a place of unbearable tension and fleeting comfort. By now, Anne Frank had lived more than a year inside its wooden ribs, her voice tucked inside a checkered diary and the hush of whispers. But this isn't just a story of confinement. It's a story of awakening, of a child turning into a philosopher, of a girl becoming her own witness. Because even as the world threatened to erase her, Anne was learning to write herself into permanence. The year was 1943. While battles raged from Stalingrad to North Africa, inside the annex, silence reigned. By day, the Frank family and their companions, Herman, Auguste, and Peter Van Pels and Fritz Pfeffer, had to become shadows. They couldn't flush the toilet. They couldn't run the tap. They couldn't move without risking discovery. The warehouse workers below knew nothing of the hidden lives above. The very creak of a board could mean capture. Anne recorded it all. She wrote about the fear, yes, but also the absurdity of it. The arguments over who used too much toilet paper. The tension of 8 people trapped in 500 square feet. The smell of spoiled food. The weight of unspoken things. But more than anything, she wrote about herself. Anne Frank, now 14, was changing, sharpening. She was no longer the giggling child from Frankfurt or the hopeful student from Amsterdam. She was becoming a thinker and a writer. Her entries began to stretch beyond the diary. She rewrote passages. She imagined short stories. She toyed with ideas for a novel based on the annex itself. She read constantly, philosophy, history, literature. She began seeing Kitty, her diary, not as a secret friend, but as the first step in a career. She wasn't just hiding from Nazis. She was fighting obscurity, with ink, with fire, with an honesty that could slice through history. The people around her, Peter, her mother, even her beloved father, often became characters in her emotional theater. She argued often with Edith Frank. Their personalities clashed like waves against rock. Edith was quiet, reserved, and Anne, bold, volcanic, relentless in her pursuit of truth. But even in conflict, Anne's reflections were nuanced. She could criticize and still ache for closeness. She could rebel and still crave love. With Peter Van Pels, the awkward son of the Van Pels family, a different relationship unfolded. First irritation, then curiosity, then something tender. They talked in the attic, beneath the slanted roof and the dusty skylight. They shared stories. They kissed once or twice. They confided their fears. And Anne, ever the chronicler of emotion, questioned whether it was love or simply the human need for connection in isolation. But outside, the world was shattering. Every radio broadcast brought darker news. Allied advances were slow. The Gestapo tightened their grip. Jews across the Netherlands were being rounded up in the thousands. Even those in hiding were betrayed. By neighbors, by fear, by hunger. Inside the annex, the adults whispered at night, their voices a low hum of dread. Anne, listening, began to see that survival wasn't just about avoiding Nazis. It was about resisting despair. One night she wrote, "It's difficult in times like these. Ideals, dreams, and cherished hopes rise within us, only to be crushed by grim reality. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart." Those words would echo through classrooms, courtrooms, and memorials for decades. But when Anne wrote them, she was a teenager in hiding, unsure if she'd see another season. She wasn't writing for posterity, she was writing to stay human. Spring turned to summer in 1944, and with it came flickers of hope. The D-Day landings, June 6th, the Allied invasion of Normandy, the beginning of what many prayed would be liberation. Anne was electrified. She wrote pages of optimism, of the possibility of freedom. She imagined returning to school, publishing her book, becoming a journalist or novelist, or a voice for the unheard. And then, in early August, without warning, the knock came. Not on the front door, but on the soul. The annex was betrayed. Historians still debate by whom. A disgruntled employee? A neighbor? A stroke of cruel luck? No one can say for certain. But on August 4th, 1944, the secret was no longer safe. SS officers burst in, guns drawn, shouting orders. Anne and the others were dragged from the annex like ghosts pulled from a dream. 2 years. 2 years of whispers, hope, and fragile peace. Shattered in seconds. Miep Gaius, one of their Dutch protectors, watched helplessly as they were taken. She later found Anne's diary scattered across the annex floor, and instead of throwing it away, she gathered it, kept it, protected it, because something in those pages felt alive. Anne Frank's journey as a writer ended in that annex, but her story, her voice, was just beginning to echo. The next chapter would not be written by her hand, but by history, because from there, the path led through gates of steel and ash. First to Westerbork, then to Auschwitz, and finally, to the nightmare called Bergen-Belsen. There's a strange, hollow silence that follows great loss. When the noise of tragedy subsides, when the boots stop marching, the sirens fade, the shouting gives way to an unbearable quiet, what's left is something far heavier than sound. It is absence. After the war ended, Amsterdam was a city of absences. Streets that once bustled with children were now lined with empty bicycles, rusting and riderless. Homes were left open, windows cracked as if their owners might still return. And one man, Otto Frank, stood at the center of it all. He had come back alone. His wife Edith had died in Auschwitz. His daughters Anne and Margot had perished in Bergen-Belsen, likely just weeks before liberation. The entire fabric of his family, torn away by the machinery of genocide. But then, something unexpected returned to him. A collection of notebooks, a stack of loose papers, pages filled with handwriting he knew better than his own. Curled, looped, youthful, and unmistakably Anne's. Miep Gijs, one of the brave Dutch citizens who had helped hide the Frank family, had discovered the diary after the arrest. She kept it safe, unread, preserved in hope that Anne might return for it. When Otto took the diary into his hands, he wasn't holding a book. He was holding her. For weeks, he couldn't bring himself to read it. The grief was too raw. But when he finally turned the first page, he found himself face to face with the vibrant, brilliant, infuriating, loving, questioning daughter he had lost. She had captured it all: the annex, the fear, the absurdity of life in hiding, the petty arguments, the small joys, her dreams of becoming a writer, her struggles with identity, womanhood, injustice, God, and most of all, her belief in the goodness of people despite everything. Otto knew this was not a private document. It was a witness to a crime so vast it threatened to become abstract, a witness to what had been stolen, not just lives, but possibilities, futures, voices. So he began the painstaking process of preparing it for publication. In 1947, Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex, was published in Dutch. At first, it made only a modest impression. The world was still reeling. Was it too soon? Too painful? But slowly the diary spread. German, French, English. With each translation, Anne's voice traveled farther, crossing oceans, climbing into classrooms and hearts. Readers were stunned. They expected horror. Instead, they found humanity. Yes, Anne wrote about fear, but also lipstick, first love, feeling misunderstood, wanting to be seen. She wasn't a saint. She was real, and that made her powerful. Her words cut through time. They made readers confront the Holocaust not as history, but as loss. Anne became the daughter people never met, but instantly recognized. The diary appeared on school reading lists. Literary critics praised its lyricism. Psychologists analyzed her reflections. Survivors saw their own stories in hers. And Otto watched quietly. He never stopped grieving. But he had found a mission. In 1960, the secret annex opened as a museum. People stood in line for hours. The stairs creaked. The narrow rooms held an oppressive stillness. Visitors wept. Some left notes. Others stood silent, overcome. What was once a hiding place became a beacon of remembrance. But as the years passed, a new battle began. As Anne's fame grew, so did the deniers. They spread lies, said the diary was fake, that no girl could write like that it was part of a plot. It was a bitter irony. In trying to erase Anne, they only made her voice louder. Experts authenticated the diary. Original pages were examined. Witnesses came forward. No credible scholar ever doubted it. And Otto stood firm. He had known the girl who wrote those words. Her truth needed no defense. But still, he defended her. Until his final breath. By the 1970s and 80s, Anne had become a cultural icon. Her name appeared in songs, poems, speeches. Her story was adapted into plays and films. In 1995, on what would have been her 66th birthday, President Bill Clinton held up her diary and said, "This is the voice we must never forget." In Japan, schoolchildren studied Anne as part of their moral education. In South Africa, during apartheid, her story inspired those fighting injustice. But with fame came danger, the risk of sanitizing her. There's a temptation to remember Anne only as hopeful, only as forgiving. But that is not the full picture. Her diary is also angry, frustrated, confused. She questions God. She criticizes the adults around her. She refuses to be simplified. And that refusal, that authenticity, is what makes her timeless. Today, Anne's voice remains painfully relevant. In classrooms, her diary is read aloud by students from war-torn regions. In refugee camps, her story teaches identity, belonging, and resilience. Activists fighting discrimination find in Anne a symbol of the quiet power of truth. She reminds us, the oppressed are not faceless. They are children with dreams, writers with unfinished sentences, and she reminds us of the fragility of freedom. A civilized society can descend into barbarity, not through explosions, but through small steps. Laws passed, rights eroded, neighbors turned away, and one day you find yourself hiding behind a bookshelf, writing by candlelight, trying to remember the sun. There is something mythic in the fact that Anne's words survived when so many did not. The Nazis, with all their power, were defeated. Their leaders fled in shame. Their monuments crumbled. But the voice of a teenage girl, scribbled in secret in fear, endured. She did not raise a weapon. She raised a pen. And somehow that pen proved more enduring than 1,000 salutes. Otto Frank lived to see the diary read by millions. He died in 1980 at 91. But the legacy Anne created did not end. To read Anne's diary is to inherit a responsibility, not just to remember, but to ask how we are complicit in silence. Anne's story is not unique because she was extraordinary. It's unique because she told it. There were thousands like her, thousands of stories never written. But Anne left us a window, a chance to see, not just horror, but humanity. And that is why her voice still matters, why it still echoes, why it still interrupts our comfort and calls us to attention. Because history doesn't repeat out of malice. It repeats when we forget. And Anne Frank, through her words, through her life, through her loss, refuses to let us forget. The legacy of Anne Frank is more than the story of a girl in hiding. It's a mirror to humanity. In it, we don't just see the past. We see the choices we make every day. To remember or forget, to speak or stay silent, to see others as kin or as strangers. Since its publication, Anne's voice has become a call for justice and compassion. Her words remind us the fight against hatred is ongoing and personal. It happens not just in courts or parliaments, but in classrooms, homes, and quiet moments when we choose empathy over indifference. In 1999, UNESCO declared Anne Frank's diary a World Documentary Heritage. Not just an honor, a warning, a call to protect this memory. Because Anne's story isn't a relic, it's a living testament to human resilience. Her diary is a human story, messy, honest. It shows our capacity for cruelty and our longing for freedom. That's why Anne's story endures. It reflects not just history, but the human condition. Today, as new generations face old hatreds, her diary remains vital. It urges us to see beyond labels, to recognize human dignity. It reminds us that darkness often begins with small acts of hate, and it calls us to act, to defend peace, speak out, cherish freedom. Anne Frank's life was heartbreakingly short. Her diary ended abruptly, but her voice still echoes and will continue as long as we remember.